So we talked about how anarchists have this idea that human nature is essentially community based and community oriented. Interestingly, libertarianism, which is similar in that it the view calls for less government intervention, is instead really built on this sort of individual, almost egoist conception of humans. So they libertarians do think that governments have some role to play in the development of society, but they want to limit its authority to the negative rights of human beings. So they want to say, okay, we can have government, but really they're mostly it mostly should exist to protect individuals' property and personal rights. So things like police forces are okay, or courts to the extent that they're going to protect someone from being stolen from, and so on and so forth. So things like that. Other state actions like building roads, education, helping the poor are not legitimate uses for government funds, according to libertarianism. So why think this? Well, one of the ways they justify this view is appeal to this idea of John Locke's law of nature. And this law basically that he says that all people are subject to really just talks about that we should not harm others' life, liberty, or possessions. So Locke thinks that reasonable human beings will adhere to this law, and that and for libertarians then government is needed only to ensure that this law is respected, that humans respect it. And again, this is because, unlike anarchists, they think that human beings will not necessarily do this on their own, that humans are not tied to the community and the collective in the way that anarchists tend to think. So rather than a utilitarian justification of this, like saying, okay, look, we want to have this limited government because it will produce the most good for the most people, instead utilitarians argue for this, libertarians argue for this limited government on the idea of instead something like Kant's formulation of the categorical imperative. So the idea is that people's autonomy is paramount, and they must be treated as ends and not as means only. And any government intervention that goes above this protection of people's rights to their possessions and so on is going to violate their autonomy and treat them as means only. So the utilitarian idea that we should sacrifice some of our extra stuff, or that we should think about the happiness of all beings, is, according to libertarians, just a way to limit our freedom. It's a way to force people to treat themselves as means and not as ends. So the idea is, if I'm going to be forced to help someone with less money than me, then I am being used as a means. So unsurprisingly then, an unequal distribution of wealth is okay, according to Nozick and other libertarians, depending on the way this inequality came about. So if people at the top got more money and stuff and whatever by stealing from other people, then that's not legitimate. But if they just are lucky, or they work hard, or they are born into money, or any of these other reasons, then it's okay. So as long as they didn't hurt anyone else by getting more wealth than others, then it's legitimate, according to libertarians. So some people might see this wealth inequality as a problem. And also, it seems like libertarianism allows for the possibility that one person or a very small group of people could end up controlling all the resources in the society, as long as they get it by what libertarians would consider a just manner, which might not be the same as what other people might consider a just manner. But in any case, so Locke, again, is used as justification for this sometimes. And Locke had this idea that, okay, any legitimate control of resources must leave, as he says, enough and is good in common for others. So as long as other people have enough wealth to survive, and it's not clear how much this is supposed to be, then it's okay for somebody else to have more. So for Nozick, private property ultimately benefits everyone in society because people will try to get to the top by owning the means of production, and encourages them to take risks that will make more jobs for others. So it's kind of like that trickle-down economics idea that Reagan had, which really did not work at all. The idea is that, well, we have to have powerful people in order to create jobs, in order to create wealth for the rest of us. And so, yeah, it's okay for some people to have more. But there are a number of problems also that come up even aside from this idea that unequal wealth distribution is okay. One obvious point is that it's really difficult to see on libertarianism how you can have public goods like public schools, libraries, parks, roads, because if you're not going to tax anyone or require anyone with wealth to provide anything for those who are less wealthy, but only give them the option, like they can do it if they want to, they're probably not going to. So depending on those with means to decide what to spend their money on is probably not the best way to get a public infrastructure that's going to work. So it's hard to see how libertarianism can avoid having a society that wouldn't have parks, roads, hospitals, all these public goods that we take for granted, schools, etc. And libertarians are not often moved by this criticism, but it seems like that they should be moved by the idea of libertarianism moving clearly to monopoly. So businesses are not going to really stop, and wealthy people are not going to stop necessarily on their own accord. If they're allowed to accumulate as much wealth as they want to, they're probably going to do that. Businesses are also going to focus on making money because it's what business is. They're not going to self-regulate when it comes to wages, labor relations, environmental impact, which we'll talk about in a minute, because that's not what businesses do. And monopolistic companies can, on this conception, without government intervention, they can become, in a sense, the government themselves. So if the monopolistic companies end up controlling enough wealth, as we already know, they can control politicians as well, and this is already happening. And then effectively the monopolistic companies end up becoming the kind of interventionist government that libertarians are trying to avoid. So if your business gets powerful enough, it becomes the government. Businesses are not going to respect individual rights because businesses are about making money. So at that point, they're going to change the laws to benefit themselves. They're going to buy off the politicians, become the politicians. We're going to have an oligarchy where the business becomes the government, private industry becomes the government. So it seems like without some kind of regulation, this is what's going to happen on a libertarian conception with companies. They're going to essentially become just the kind of government that libertarians want to avoid. And a side point that comes up when we start talking about this is the idea of negative externalities, and this is the undesirable effects of a group or an individual's actions on uninvolved parties. In this case, what we're talking about is businesses that do bad stuff as part of making money. So most of the time this is environmental effects, but there can be other things too. So, for example, if there's no government intervention, if there's no government control over business, then it seems like any business could just dump their hazardous waste in the river. Any business could just burn whatever they want. And there's no reason to think that they would not do that, because if it makes money, that's what businesses do. And so if you allow business to not be regulated, they're going to just produce as much money as they can, and they're not going to pay for the environmental effects, which are then going to have to be paid for somehow. Without government, it's not clear how. So the lack of self-regulation that's going to go on with businesses is just a huge problem for the idea of libertarianism, because it seems like on a strictly libertarian view, you're going to end up with, again, government that is just business that does what it wants, produces externalities with no consequences, and basically it's not going to end up with the kind of freedom that libertarians envisioned, because people are going to be essentially controlled by businesses in the same way that the libertarians were afraid they were going to be controlled by government. And then business is going to do things that are not helpful to the community because there's no reason for them to do that. They need to be given a reason, or they're going to just do whatever makes the most money. So libertarianism seems like it's not a very viable political theory, and we'll see next time some other examples of political theories.